artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Welcome to episode 247. And today we're talking with a man who has fundamentally reshaped the landscape of digital technology. Your experience of the internet owes a large part of its identity to my guest, Tim O'Reilly, the founder, CEO, and chairman of O'Reilly Media, which he describes as the company that has been providing the picks and shovels of learning to the Silicon Valley gold rush for the past 35 years. A publishing and media platform that has connected and informed the people at ground zero of the online revolution since before there was a World Wide Web, through every medium from books to blogs. And the man behind that company has catalyzed and promoted the great thought movements that shaped how the digital world unfolded, such as open source, the principle of freedom and transparency in sharing the code that makes up the moving parts of that world, notably through the Open Source Conference, which was like Woodstock for developers and ran from the beginning of that era for many years, and which I personally presented at many times. Named by Inc. magazine as the Oracle of Silicon Valley, Tim created the term Web 2.0 to denote the shift towards the era where users like you and me participate by creating our own content, which turned into social media, and which is now just part of the digital water we swim in. His 2017 book, WTF, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us, explores the technological forces on our world and how to harness them for a better future. We're going to talk about intellectual property rights in the generative AI era. Taylor Swift will make an appearance again, and Tim's conversations with Sam Altman, parallels with the evolution of Linux, comparing incentives with social media, the future of content-generating work, and opportunities for entrepreneurial flowering. Let's get into the interview with a true thought leader, Tim O'Reilly. Tim O'Reilly, fantastic to welcome you to AI and You. And I've just got to put a personal note in here that's going to date me, but I owe you so much for my own career because back late 80s, early 90s, I had just gotten a Unix workstation at work and needed to learn something called the X window system, which basically is how you talk to a computer that's not a PC or a Mac in anything more complicated than text. And it's pretty difficult thing to learn. And there were these books that told me exactly what I needed to know. And all of the reference and all of the tutorial, and I just got those. And you wrote those, and that was fantastic. And then a few years later, there was Perl, and I was like, wow, this lets me do what I can do in C, but with the flexibility and portability of shell programming. It can run anywhere. And I needed to learn that. And there was the Camel book again from you. So I just got to say thank you for what you did there, because my career would have been quite different had you not done those things.
Yeah, well, try to be in the right place at the right time. There's an awful lot happening in the world today that is incredibly exciting. And I'm really just happy to be in the middle of all of it still.
Right. And one of the things that you were right at the inception of was the burgeoning of the open source movement and open source conventions. And you were instrumental in that. And that raised a whole lot of issues around copyright and intellectual property. And it made new solutions, new approaches acceptable. And now it seems that we have parallel issues around AI being trained on intellectual property and copyright. It's not repeating it, but it does seem to rhyme with what was going on before. And what do you think is the discussion that we need to have around intellectual property and copyright with respect to the training of AI?
I think, first of all, it's a very complex issue. And it's interesting that you bring up the parallels with open source software, and you can take the wrong lesson. Because, of course, certainly when Richard Stallman started talking about free software, he was talking about the fact that people were exercising intellectual property rights. And he thought the software should be freely available to be modified. And in fact, he tried to come up with a new intellectual property regime that you could basically make it so the only way you could create this thing that would sort of poison intellectual property. And certainly many of his intellectual descendants are people who say, well, of course, it's perfectly reasonable for AI to ingest everybody's work because, hey, copyright is evil and it's really important for the advancement of knowledge that it's free to read. Now, of course, it's a much more nuanced discussion than that because it's free to read, but then, well, what do you do once you've read it? And I look, certainly in my own thinking about that, I look at the comparison with, say, Google Books. 15 years ago, when Google set out to build an index of all the world's books, publishers revolted, and I was on Google's side because I said, look, they are reading the books just like you and I can read the book. And then they are creating an index, just kind of like you might make a card catalog or whatever. And they are sending you traffic. And this is a good thing. It's just what happened on the web. They read it. They did not create a substitute for it. They created something that made it easier for people to find this thing. But fast forward 12 years, really, till you started it down this path with OpenAI. And you're basically having people ingesting all this content and then creating a competitive substitute for the original content. Now, that's not always true because, of course, in my field where it's literally knowledge-based, and you can now ask AI a question, and if it's been trained on an O'Reilly book, you'll get the answer without having to ever pay the author. Maybe that's more of a challenge. It's sort of interesting that the legal challenges have come from like fiction authors. And the fact is, if you are writing fiction, if an AI is trained on your work, I'm not sure people are really going to be buying that work as a substitute. Yes, maybe, but that whole world is much more like music. It's like, yeah, if somebody comes out as a new star, think about Taylor Swift, and there's all these Taylor Swift knockoffs, right? That's just the way that kind of creative world works. But in the case of specialized knowledge, maybe it is actually that they are literally taking intellectual property and using it to create a substitute, an AI lawyer, an AI programmer, whatever. So those are kind of interesting issues. I have two sides to that. First off, I want the AI companies to be engaging with that as a problem and not just kind of going, well, we're going to take it. When Sam first called me back in, I think it was 2022, he said, can we train on O'Reilly books? And I said, yeah, I'd love to come to some kind of arrangement with you if you can help me figure out how to keep paying my authors, because this is always our issue. We have to create an economic incentive for people to keep creating this content. That's what we're in the business of doing. I kind of told them the story of various books that we thought needed to exist. And back in the days of when there were open documentation licenses, and I would talk to authors and I would say, okay, you want to write this book and you want to be as widely available as possible, we'll publish it under an open license. And then other people will go, no, I want to make as much money as possible from it because otherwise I don't have time to do it. And I go, okay, then you don't want the open license. You want to do it this way. So it was sort of interesting. I've always been very pragmatic about that. There's different strategies for intellectual property based on what your goal is. So I wrote a piece back around 2000 called Piracy is Progressive Taxation, which is that free actually makes you more visible. But if you are like already popular, it probably is a tax on you. It's just like progressive taxation. If you're already rich and people pirate you, you can probably afford to pay out some of that. If you're not rich and nobody's noticing you, it gives you an opportunity to be seen. So there's all these funny dynamics. And so I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to the economic issues around AI. But I think that the people who create it need to be committed or should be committed to a vision of a world that preserves economic incentives for creators and doesn't basically take this short-term vision that we're going to just expropriate. In a lot of ways, the business model of the big AI companies looks a lot like classic colonialism. We're going to take your resources and then we'll sell finished products back to you. But most of the value that's created will go to us. But let me move that even a little further over to this sort of question of architecture. I've always thought about this, and even back in the days of open source. I wrote a little short piece called AI and the Architecture of Participation. And it was really came a lot of ways off of a comment that Linus Torvalds had made when we were doing a sort of a book of interviews called Open Sources. And he said, I could not have built a new kernel for Windows, even if I had had the access to all the source code. He said the architecture didn't support it. So the fact that Unix had this architecture that was already designed with so small pieces loosely joined, so somebody could take off a bite-sized piece and write something new that was compatible. Unix was a communications-oriented operating system, and that meant it was cooperating pieces, whereas Windows was a big integrated lump. And it turned out that when people tried to make open source versions of big integrated lumps of software, like the GIMP is a replacement for Photoshop, or when OpenOffice, which was Sun's version of a competitor to Microsoft Office, was open source, it didn't work because it didn't have the architecture of participation. So fast forward to today, and you go, where's the architecture of participation for AI? And what I mean by that is if we want to have a world in which knowledge creation is incentivized and people can build value with AI on their own, it doesn't really fit very well with a big winner-takes-all centralized architecture where the only way you can do that is by basically getting your AI services from one big centralized provider. And that reminded me, and this leads me to something that I've kind of pointed out. People sort of think, oh, OpenAI is going to be the next Google. And I think actually maybe they're already just the next AOL. Because in the early days of us all going online with content, AOL was the big centralized provider. And it's funny because there was this quote in an article called AI's Original Sin that came out in the New York Times. And they interviewed a lawyer for Andreessen Horowitz. And he said, this is the only possible way for this to happen. And I thought, well, back in 1990 or so, AOL was the only possible way that companies could put their content online. But there was this new thing that happened called the World Wide Web. And companies like Microsoft started something called the Microsoft Network, which was their answer to AOL. And I remember having a conversation with Nathan Myhrvold at PC Forum, where he said, there's two kinds of documents in the world. There's a few documents that are read by millions of people and millions of documents that are read by a few people. And then there's this really interesting space in the middle. And that's what we're going to do with the Microsoft Network. And I remember getting up and during the Q&A after he's talking, I said, Nathan, I think you're absolutely right. But there's this thing called the World Wide Web. Have you heard about it? Because that's where this is really happening. It has this architecture of participation. We have our own server. We can put out our own content. We don't have to pay you a tax in order to do that. So if you think about what does OpenAI's architecture look like, it looks like the architecture of AOL or the Microsoft Network. We can build content, but only if we pay you a tax. Whereas, what is the architecture that comes from Llama and DeepSeek? It's an architecture where we can have our own AI, we can build our own services, and then the question is, how do they work together? And I think that's a really much more interesting world.
But aren't Llama and DeepSeek also trained on the same corpus?
Yes. Again, I would say none of this is simple. They are, but they still make it possible for people to build something without paying a serious tax. So then the question is, well, what can we build differently? Again, you can do any of these things on top of OpenAI or Anthropic or whatever. But I think that open markets tend to be more competitive. And if you see already, for example, the cost of inference coming way down because of the competition from DeepSeek. But I also think that there's a whole question of when it's centralized, what are the commercial incentives? So, for example, Mark Zuckerberg is sort of talking about personalized AI, and we're going to have one that works just for our customers. But what are the incentives? Demonstrated incentives of social media. The demonstrated incentives of social media are, we're going to basically addict you to our services. And that's not really under our control. And again, kind of going back to your original question about open source software, I remember Michael Tiemann, who was at Cygnus Solutions, which is one of the early tools companies for open source. And then they got acquired by Red Hat. And he said, well, what we sell at Red Hat is control. You get to build your own services. You get to figure out what you want to do. And so even though, I guess the horse is out of the barn around all the content being slurped up, although of course there's new content being produced, and the question is, should it be slurped up? I think Google is pretty good about that. I don't know about any of the other providers. I suspect, for example, in the case of O'Reilly content, they got pirated books and just trained anyway. And I think that's very short-sighted. But I also think that, okay, well, that just ups the game. And I do think that the game, in a certain way, is when knowledge gets commodified, something else becomes valuable. And I think that something else is a unique point of view and creativity.
How much does the future architecture of AI depend upon the economic models for things like content? I mean, as a not rich content provider, I definitely see the problems in AI being trained on anything I output. And I spend a lot of time asking myself every day before I would go to a talk, what can I give an audience that they can't get out of ChatGPT? Because until I have a good answer to that, I'm not in a good place. And yet also the utility of these models, what they provide, what's available to us when you've got something that's trained on so much information, the emergent effects there, is clearly something that we want and need to persist because of the foundational transformation that it provides to knowledge work. So it's maybe there's a irresistible force meeting an immovable object here, then one of them's got to give way. Because one way or another, we will have this. It's going to continue.
I totally agree. But I do think that if you look at the history of the world,
that might take a while, but yes.
But there's a recurrent economic pattern, which is that something which was once very valuable becomes a commodity. Let's take salt. Salt was so valuable that it was part of what Roman soldiers were paid with. Spices in general, there was all the
salary.
East India Company. Yeah, the word salary literally comes from the word for salt. Okay, salt became a commodity. And yet today, you buy omnivore salt, you buy Celtic sea salt, you buy, or take it to coffee. Coffee, my parents drank coffee from a 5-pound can, and now people will pay the same amount of money for a latte, and they'll pay a ton more for, oh, this is organic coffee. Oh, wait, it's not just organic coffee, it's fair trade organic coffee. Oh, it's not just fair trade organic coffee, it's from this particular region. It's from this particular producer. It was roasted by this particular roaster. And so there's this whole mixing in of values and ideas that makes things valuable. And so if you look at Substack, for example, it's this whole new media phenomenon with people who used to maybe work for a newspaper, and now they have their own place and their own voice because they have a unique value-add perspective that is uniquely them. And I think that we're going to be seeing that in more and more knowledge domains because, yes, you can, in fact, start to say, like I could say, hey, analyze this news event in the style of Ezra Klein, but it wouldn't be Ezra Klein, and people know the difference. And maybe it'll eventually be good enough that someone will be able to create an AI that will do a perfect Ezra Klein take on something. But at that point, you kind of go, oh, actually, maybe it's not copyright, it's something else. It's like you can't actually emulate. It's like even if you've been trained on all this stuff, you can't output in the guise of a person with a unique point of view without their permission. And so there's all kinds of interesting new ways that we could skin that, because the issue of point of view and perspective and texture of style and values, I think is something that is not intrinsic to AI. It's basically, it's going to move for the average. And of course, human creativity has always been, well, what's the unexpected? So all the people who are having the AI write their papers, they're good, middle of the road, even at their best. They don't have necessarily that unique spark. Maybe we'll get to a point where AIs are able to do that, but then there'll be participants in this meeting of minds.
And it's a very interesting point that you brought up there with AI not being able to produce a convincing imitation of, say, Ezra Klein. And in many applications of AI at the moment, it doesn't rise to the level of the best human. That's spotty because, for instance, chess and Go, those AIs will beat every human. And we can have AI that produces an imitation of Beethoven that no one can tell wasn't Beethoven. But by and large, in creating, say, text output, it won't convincingly imitate as well as the best human being. But we should look at, what about the average or the good? Because that's where AI does move the bar. And so the second string columnists, whose names we don't know, like Ezra Klein, but there's countless thousands of them out there trying to make a living. Well, now we are talking about a threat, and you can multiply that across so many domains.
Are we really? I mean, basically, okay, so I'll give you two choices. One is the Daily AI, right? And it's writing a bunch of news stories and hot takes on politics, on what's new in science. You go, okay, this is a purely useful information stream. And maybe that's analogous to what you today get from the Associated Press or UPI, but it is not equivalent to what you get when you read the opinionated takes or the firsthand reporting, because that's the other thing that's completely missing from those AI takes is here's a reporter on the ground and they're capturing, the AI just can't get out there. It can only get that from a human being. I was on the front lines in Ukraine and I was talking to soldiers in the trenches and watching them as they were kind of guiding their drones. And this guy said that, and that was like, that's very different than what you get in an AI. Or similarly, you're creating some new kind of writing and maybe it's derivative, but maybe it's original. It's actually Pride and Prejudice and zombies. And maybe AI can be helpful with some of those things, but it will be one of the things, again, that I think is super important to understand with AI, at least right now, and maybe we'll have a different conversation in the future, but at least right now, if you don't ask an AI to do something, it just sits there and does nothing. So it is a tool of humans because we have volition. When we actually have artificial volition and AIs are saying, waking up in the morning and saying, I think I'm going to work on this interesting problem that nobody solved before, then I'll be worried about humans being made obsolete. But as long as somebody gets up in the morning and says, guess what? I'm going to use this AI to do this research project, and I'm trying to figure out how to solve this disease or solve this business problem or build a better interface to my services, then I go, people just got this amazing power tool. And we're not getting up in the morning and watching a bunch of saws and power drills assembling a house. I mean, it's just not happening. If you look at this piece I'm just writing, that's going to come out tomorrow, I think. I referenced the work of this guy, James Besson, who is an economic historian who looked at the transition from crafting to the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. And he found that there was this sort of narrative that skilled weavers were replaced by unskilled factory workers. And what he found was, and just by looking at pay records, how long did it take somebody to go from being a beginner to actually fully paid? It took just as long in the new system. It was just they were more productive. They had different skills. And of course, this is what's now all been over since everybody's talking about Jevons paradox. When something becomes cheaper, people use more of it. Okay? So knowledge is going to be cheaper, and we're going to use more of it. So we'll be able to tackle problems. And different people have brought up some other interesting points. Sam Skillock, who's one of the deputy CTOs at Microsoft, wrote this great piece about, which is something I hadn't thought about. Metallurgy came into its own because of the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly we're building machines that need better metals, right? And so we're going to suddenly be building these new knowledge machines that are going to need all kinds of new science and new engineering and new technologies. I guess all I'm saying is we're not going to spend our time on the old things. We're going to spend our time on new things. And so the right question to ask is, what is the most competitive architecture with the lowest barriers to innovation? And my observation throughout my career has been that open architectures, participatory architectures lead to the most innovative periods. If you look at the history of the personal computer, you look at the early internet, these are the times that were incredibly productive. Everything was wide open. Anybody could come in and suddenly start inventing things.
Yes, yeah.
And I think we're heading into another one of those.
Definitely the parallels with .com are numerous. And you reminded me of a conversation we had with Neil Brown from the Poynter Institute a few weeks ago on the show about reporting and the future of journalism in this. And your point about humans being the initiators is very well taken. That was the resolution for me of that question. I had that existential question of what is my value, is that humans are the ones asking the questions and AI is the ones providing the answers. So our role is to come up with better questions and better thinking.
Of course, that brings up Richard Feynman, who said that questions were always more interesting than answers.
That's the end of the first half of the interview. Next half, next week. A lot to unpack there. And engaging in those questions about the rights of content creators with Tim's characteristic high-level view that gives you these paradigm shift type interpretations. I mean, one day historians will be writing books about this period and they'll have it all sussed out and know how to describe it. But right now, when we're in the middle of it, it's really hard to see the forest for the trees. And Tim comes the closest of anyone to giving us the view of the forest right now. By the way, this conversation was totally evoking an earlier era of my life when I was, as I alluded to, heavily involved in teaching the Perl computer language and going to O'Reilly open source conferences, which, trivia moment, started out as the Perl Conference in 1997. San Jose, I was there. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, Google Research unveiled their new AI co-scientist system built with Gemini 2.0 that aims to help researchers generate and test new hypotheses. AI co-scientist acts like a collaborative research partner, using a coalition of specialized AI agents that generate hypotheses, evaluate them through simulated debates, use web search for fact-checking, and break problems down. Co-scientist aims to uncover genuinely new scientific knowledge. Google says the tool is meant to assist scientists, not replace them. In one of the tests, Professor Jose Pinades at Imperial College London spent 10 years figuring out how superbugs dodge antibiotics by stealing virus tails to spread between species. He gave the AI the same puzzle, and in just 48 hours, it proposed the exact same solution, plus 4 other promising ideas his team had never considered, and no, the AI hadn't seen his unpublished research. Next week, we will conclude the interview with Tim O'Reilly when we'll talk about the effects of generative AI on our work processes, what AI does to the value model of accessing information, meme stocks in the new economy, AGI, and preference alignment and market influencing leading to collective intelligence. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.